Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of Sourdough Bread Making, where we finally are going to get to bake our bread after this almost week-long process. This has been particularly long because of my quarantine brain and because I am learning how to use iMovie and YouTube, but also because we made a brand new starter which takes several days. So from now on, you can plan for just about a day and a half to a 2-day process because you only need to make a starter one time. If you are a person who ever gets distracted in your kitchen, then it's a great idea to take about half this starter and put it in a different jar, put a lid on it, seal it up tight, and put it in the freezer. That way, if you forget in the future to pull your starter and you accidentally put your other ingredients in before you remember, you'll always have a backup in the freezer. In case you're wondering, it's okay to only use half the starter because yeast multiplies during fermentation. So while you might get faster results if you start with more, you'll still end up with what you need either way. And if you are feeling confused about my referral to yeast when we're making a sourdough starter, I just want to clarify that yeast is what makes bread rise. Wild yeast is present in the air, and its use is referred to as sourdough or natural fermentation, whereas the stuff in packets is commercially cultivated. They both ultimately serve the same purpose though, and they just have variations in consistency, complexity, and timing. So now we're ready to get started. I have just turned my oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm looking at my fermented batter. It has a layer of light pink on the top, just like the starter did. And this is normal for a batter that contains buckwheat. It would not be a good sign for other ferments. And if you let it go longer, it will get darker and the sour flavor will intensify. So as you experiment with finding the level of fermentation that you like the best, just keep that in mind. And of course, it can go too long and go bad eventually. So you want to keep an eye on it and stir it down regularly. And I'm going to add those remaining ingredients except the baking powder and apple cider vinegar. So I've got my sweetener. Again, I'm using coconut sugar. You can omit that. You can use whatever you want. Honey maple syrup. Adding my salt. My chia seeds and flax seeds. I have my olive oil covered. I just want to make sure everyone knows that we want to protect our olive oil from light, heat, and air. So as I was sitting here prepping all my ingredients and being distracted by other things, I had this covered up to keep it from oxidizing. So now I'm going to pour this into the batter as well. And I always use this little excess. I just sort of invert it on top of my baking pan, and that's what I use to oil my baking pans. So I'll stir all this together. Everything's pretty well incorporated here, and now is the time to take out any batter that I don't want to bake. So you could bake just one loaf. This actually makes about the equivalent of 2.5 of the loaves that I normally make if you have ever had a loaf of bread that you've bought from me. And so you can just easily make this into 2 little bit bigger loaves. Or for me, I want to experiment a little bit with this batter. So I'm going to take out this extra, what I would consider an extra half loaf. That's about a cup of batter. I'm going to set it aside. I could freeze it. I could set aside, a whole loaf worth and put it in the freezer for another time. I'm just going to set this aside on my counter because I'm going to use it today. And now I have enough for 2 of my normal size loaves. I'm looking at the consistency here. This is a little thick. I prefer the batter to be a little thinner for the loaves. And so this would be good. I might leave it like this if I were making buns or something that I want to hold their shape. But I like the loaves to be a little bit looser. So I'm just going to stir in a little bit of water. That's just filtered water. No need to use spring water anymore because the fermentation is complete. And it doesn't have to be perfect because I'm also now ready to stir in my baking powder. Oh, before I do that though, I want to prepare my pan. So I'm just going to spread around that olive oil that I put in that was the excess in my measuring cup. I'm going to rub the excess oil on my hands because we're washing our hands a lot. And now I'm going to put in my baking powder and apple cider vinegar. So I did adjust my baking powder quantity to account for that half loaf coming out. So I did about little less than half a teaspoon less than I should have, or less than is called for in this recipe. I want to make sure my baking powder is really well incorporated because baking powder tastes really bad. and I need it to provide that little extra lift. So you can see that already, it's a nice little bit of a thinner consistency, and now I'm going to add my apple cider vinegar. That's going to thin it down just a little bit more. So now I just want to divide it evenly between my two pans. So the size of the loaf doesn't really matter, except it will, you'll have to adjust your baking time. The most important thing if you're baking a couple of loaves is that you have an even amount of batter in both pans. So now I'm just going to look at them, kind of eyeball them. You could weigh them if you really want to get crazy, but I don't want to get that crazy. I have a little bit less. I'm going to make sure I get all that batter. I get the last little bit in. And then I'm going to cover them up. Let me wash this a little bit off my hands. And now I remember those alligator clips. I'm going to put 2 clips on each baking pan. And now I'm just going to pop them in the oven. And so this is actually a different oven than I normally use, so I am going to have to experiment a little bit with baking time. I'm going to start out with about 20 minutes at 375, and then I'll turn it down to 325 for the remainder of the baking, which I expect to be about 20 minutes, but I can confirm with you when I come back. My timer just went off, and that reminded me that I needed to turn the oven from 375 to 325, so I've done that. And I set the timer for about another 20 minutes. And at that point, I think I can check on my breads and see how they're doing. And even if they're not quite done, they'll be okay if I just take a quick peek. And in the meantime, you can go ahead and get your Rejuvilac and your starter stored for whenever you're ready to use them in the future. So the Rejuvilac just needs a lid. It can be stored in the refrigerator. And it will actually store for several weeks. It may stay this beige color. It may turn a dark purple. Either way is great. And the starter, you may have already put some in the freezer. And what you do with the rest will depend on how often you bake. If you bake every day, keep it on the counter. If you bake a couple times a week, you can keep it in the refrigerator. And if you bake less than that, which I bake about once a week, and I keep mine in the freezer, but I pull it out when I soak my grains the day before I know I'm going to be ready to blend. And I find that works great. So whatever works for you, you can kind of play around with it. But either way, I'm going to put a lid on it, unless you're baking every day, in which case you can just put a towel over it. And then keep an eye on that bread. Okay, so I just checked on the bread, and it's not done yet. It probably needs another 7 to 10 minutes. So it's been baking for 40 minutes, and I put it in for another 7. It may need a few more after that. And this sort of highlights the differences from oven to oven. So I am using an oven that I've actually never used before for this recipe. I thought it would be better to mimic the home baking process because I normally bake my bread in a commercial oven that I brought home from the restaurant. And so ovens do vary quite a bit. It's great if you have an oven thermometer, but you also need to know that you are baking in your oven and your recipe was written using a different oven. So just know that you have to adjust the first 2 times you make a recipe, and don't get frustrated. Do be gentle when you open up your oven, when you open up your pans. You don't want to disturb anything if it hasn't set yet. Just get to know your oven, and it'll start to become intuitive. So now I've added another 10 minutes. They've been baking for about 50 minutes, and I feel pretty confident they're gonna be done. I'm pulling my breads out, doing my best to keep them intact here with the lids on. And I always like to check both breads because even though I eyeballed it and I think they were pretty even, they can bake unevenly. So I'm going to just take the lids off. Not going to put them in there. Okay. And so this is what they look like. So you can see it looks almost just like it could maybe cook a little bit more on top, but it feels pretty firm in the center. And I kind of want it to look that way because it's going to continue to bake. I usually like to leave these top lids on while they cool a little bit for like at least 10 or 15 minutes. And they'll continue to bake as everything does when it comes out of the oven because the heat is still there. So I'm gonna leave those sitting there. And so after about 10-15 minutes, they're gonna start to pull away from the pan and it's gonna be a lot easier for me to get them out. So I'm just gonna leave these on, let them steam, and I'll be back to pull them out. My loaves have been sitting here for about 15-20 minutes covered, and so I think they're probably ready to come out and be placed on a cooling rack to cool the rest of the way before they get sliced. I'm just gonna kind of use my spatula. I like to use a squared spatula, and I'm just kind of going around the edges. And then this one's coming up really easily, so you can see it just pops right out of the pan. I'm gonna move it onto the cooling rack. Try the next one, go around the edges. I kind of lift up as I'm going around, and this one is also popping right up. Sometimes they stick a little bit. You can feel some resistance when you kind of give them, you don't want to push them too hard, but if you just give them the slightest pull, they'll either come straight up or you'll feel a resistance. You can feel it sticking to the bottom. If you try and force it up, it will rip the bottom out. So just in that case, if your bread's not coming out easily, just pop the top of the pan back on, let it sit with that moisture in there, and it should pop out pretty easily, maybe in another 15-20 minutes, but I have left them, you know, as long as several hours, not because it takes that long, but because that's what was convenient. So just be careful as you're getting them out of the pans. It's been a few hours since these two loaves came out of the oven. It's best to let bread cool completely before slicing it, and so that's what I did. But I wanted to share the what the inside should look like, just so you have a sense of what your finished product will be. So this is a hearty bread for sure, but it's not heavy. The inside is sort of nice and soft and spongy, and it has a chewy, kind of crispy crust, just like you'd expect from any artisan sourdough bread. So I hope you love this recipe as much as I do. I hope you make it your own and play around with it, and please share your experience. I would love to hear about it. And thank you for sticking with me through this process of my first set of instructional videos. I have learned a ton, and I know I have a lot more to learn, which is great. The next recipe will be kale chips because that has been requested. And in the meantime, I'm sure there are places where I was not clear, or just where you might have questions. So please ask. The best way to get in touch with me is at juliaskitchen.co. And I look forward to the next time. Happy baking until then, and have a great weekend.